So I'm going to broaden the canvas of this morning's discussion a bit to include some history, intellectual history, and some of the submerged possibilities for a humane politics that might emerge from. What I'm going to do is to pin some of these ideas on a very fascinating and important book called Natural Supernaturalism, which is exactly on the theme of this conference that Fiona has organized. And it's a remarkable book, and I think it ought to be compulsory reading in courses on intellectual history, and it's really a book about Romanticism. A standard understanding of Romanticism has the philosophers and poets who carry its burden constructing a doctrine not so much of taste, but of psychology. A doctrine of the power of the human mind to structure experience, and in so doing, to construct meaning and value in the world it inhabits. In its most outsized aspiration, one that was familiarly purveyed in a tradition that Carlyle typified, this power was elevated to personified notions of heroes and genius, but with the recoil from the Jacobin aftermath of the French Revolution and Napoleon's own outsized talent for expansion and authority, to say nothing of Wagner's expressivism that was claimed by one sort of admirer of his to have given soul to a whole nation's voice. This version of the doctrine has been made to retreat. The Carlyle version of the doctrine has been made to retreat to a much lower profile. In the retreat to this more sober register, we can describe it just as I did a moment ago: the mind's power to construct meaning and value in the world we inhabit. I've used words like lower profile and sober register with deliberate intent, and they will recur in what follows. The canonical nomenclature with which this power of human subjectivity was elaborated has always been around the term imagination. And that term recurs incessantly in M.H. Abrams's masterpiece, Natural Supernaturalism, citing and surveying above all Wordsworth and Blake, but Coleridge and Shelley as well, and affiliating them with admirable expository skill and patience and accuracy to the abstractions of post-Kantian German philosophy. But in Abrams, the sobriety of this register is taken one deeply insightful step further in a crucial moment in the book when he sums up 334 pages of argument and textual specification by saying this: faith in apocalypse by way of revelation gave way to faith in apocalypse by way of revolution, which in turn gave way to faith in apocalypse by imagination or cognition. I want to fasten on the last three words, imagination or cognition, and draw your attention to the word or. What is obvious from the context is that it is not just there, the word or is not just there to convey a disjunction, but emphatically an equation. What he's suggesting with that offhand expression is that his extended argument has established that we may choose to call what he has placed on center stage imagination, as it has always been called by the Romantics, but we may also quite innocuously, that is to say, without any intellectual strain and without any loss or remainder, just as well choose to call it cognition instead. This is no small twist to the standard understanding of Romanticism's claim for psychology and the subjective. Yet it is not as if Abrams, in saying this, is introducing any ingredient into the Romantic conceptual repertory that is new. He is rather, by invoking and joining it with a quite different and more metaphysical aspect of Romanticism, putting into lower profile the idea that our minds and imagination are the source of value and meaning. The human psyche, at the end of his argument, is not the source in the sense of being the generator of value and meaning, but rather through its unique powers of cognition, not possessed, so far as we know, by any other subject. Human subjectivity is the apprehender of the properties of value and meaning that are present in the world, including nature, where Romanticism had always placed them. This may give the impression of a measurable deflation of the power of subjectivity, viewing it not as generative, but merely as apprehension. But a generous reading of the book suggests that that impression would be wrong. Its immediate consequence is to make ethics primarily a perceptual discipline. It's not as if Romanticism, in stressing perception, denies that there's any such thing as ethical deliberation. The point is not to set up a contrast with rational activities of the mind. Rather, the routines of weighing and ranking of values, or the self-criticism of our agency that ethical deliberation undertakes, is a secondary sophistication, only necessary when what is primary, the perception of value in the world, throws up conflicting perceptual judgments, or when our agency has been inadequate to the normative demands of the values we perceive. Such a view of ethics stands on its head the sentiment-based conception of morals in David Hume and Adam Smith. Moral sentiments on Abrams's picture are not, as they are for these philosophers, self-standing states of mind. They are our affective ways of perceiving the value-suffused layout of the world itself, which prompts these states of mind. John McDowell attributes roughly such a view to Aristotle, but that is a high philosophical location for it. Where it made a difference to public life was not in that location at all, but, as I will try and argue, in popular Christianity in crucially radical periods, such as in England in the mid-17th century, but in a wide variety of other locations as well, such as Sufi and Bhakti traditions, for instance, much exploited later by Gandhi and other heterodox movements, though I will not really speak of those in this lecture. Before I get to the matter of public life and politics and political ideals, really, I'm not going to talk about politics, but political ideals, let me stay with the high philosophical location and try to present an argument for this perceptual understanding of value, for those who may not find it immediately intuitive. An argument that brings out the essential link that value has to agency. John McDowell, who really has attributed this view to Aristotle and elaborated it, interestingly, doesn't argue for it. McDowell doesn't believe in arguing for it. But I'm going to try and provide an argument by providing this an argument for this romantic understanding of the metaphysics of value. Of course, none of the romantic poets presented an argument of this kind, and certainly popular Christianity didn't, but they were not salaried philosophers. Why, it might be asked, should we not see value as emerging from our mentality, our affective mentality, our desires, say? Why should we not, in the way suggested by Hume and Adam Smith, see our desires and moral sentiments as the self-standing sources of normativity? Why must we instead see our desires and moral sentiments themselves as effective perceptual conduits to normativity as it is presented in a realist metaphysics of value that was, if Harold Bloom is right, first proposed by the Gnostics and then found in a centuries-long Romantic tradition that includes much of popular Christianity through many of the canonical Romantics in England and Germany that Abram studies, all the way down to Ruskin and Morris, to Horkheimer and Adorno, and then, as I said, to Gandhi, who tapped many indigenous traditions in the South. An analytical answer, so I'm now going to briefly shift registers to idioms from intellectual history and analytic philosophy. An analytical answer to this question, why desires are not self-standing but are ways of perceiving value in the world, an analytical answer to it might begin by pointing to something very familiar to everyone. That when we ask questions of value, for instance, ask the question, what ought I to do, we are not in a detached mode of thought, such as we are when we ask the question, what is the case? This suggests that the standard understanding of the distinction between value and fact is really a misleadingly stated distinction between an engaged and a detached perspective that we possess. Now, philosophers have tended to think of these engaged and detached perspectives as perspectives we have on ourselves. Thus, when Sartre asked, what is the difference between intending to do something and predicting that we will do it, his underlying philosophical ambition was to suggest that the latter is a kind of bad faith, because it abdicates the perspective of agency or engagement for a detached perspective on ourselves. So if you ask the question, what do I predict I will do? Sartre claimed that was bad faith because you are taking a detached perspective on yourself. Sartre really had a tendency to completely totalize the perspective of agency, denying any legitimate point to a detached perspective on ourselves, which is why he sometimes spoke of all of psychoanalysis as a regime of bad faith. The mirror image of this totalization of one perspective may be found in what philosophers call naturalisms, that totalize the detached perspective on ourselves, reducing values, desires, moral sentiments to psychological tendencies or dispositions. This tendency to totalize in each direction is, of course, the sort of thing that philosophers are given to, in just the way that led Wittgenstein to suggest that philosophy needs exorcism. In this deflationary, anti-totalizing understanding of our philosophical outlook that Wittgenstein was proposing, we might ask a question that would only seem paradoxical to those who were not yet on board with that anti-totalizing outlook. So here's the question. Why is it that a detached understanding of ourselves, I think this is a very fascinating thing that philosophers should really explore much more. Why is it that a detached understanding of ourselves, when writ small, illuminates and even sometimes liberates us from the tyrannies of our own subjectivities, but when writ large, abdicates our agency and subjectivity altogether? Thus, for instance, Stuart Hampshire likens Spinoza to Freud in pointing out how Spinoza thought it is liberating for our agency to get a detached understanding of ourselves on this or that occasion, of a hostile remark here, or an unnecessarily flamboyant display of politeness there. But if all we had was a detached understanding of ourselves, if we totalized this detachment, If all we had was a detached understanding of ourselves, if we only thought in the predictive and explanatory mode about ourselves, that would, far from liberating us and enhancing our agency, would deprive us of our agency altogether. As I said, writ small, detachment about ourselves enhances our agency. Writ large, it destroys it. And that's, I think, a very interesting phenomenon. The very thing, when writ small, enhances our agency, when writ large, destroys it. This point is crucial in order to establish why our desires and moral sentiments are not self-standing, but responses to perceptible properties of value. Let me try to establish this by first extending a point made by the philosopher Gareth Evans about beliefs. I want to extend it to desires. Consider the fact, this is extending Evans's point about beliefs to desires, consider the fact that when we are asked, do you desire X, you often don't, in fact you paradigmatically don't, scan your interior to check and see if that desire exists. Rather, you consider the desirability or value of X. That is, when asked a question about a state of mind of yours, whether you desire X, you don't scan your states of mind, you scan the object that you desire. So a question about the mind is answered by looking at the world, at objects, or actual or imagined. So I've extended, Evans made that point about beliefs, and I've extended it to desires. I put it this way because the question that I want to ask is, what would our relationship to our desires have to be if one never considered the desirability of X when asked, do you desire X? And instead always scanned our interiors to see if we possess the desire for X. It would mean, if we always did that, never considered the desirability of X, but always scanned our interior to see whether we desired X, then it would mean that we always had a detached perspective on our desires, observing them as if they belonged to someone who just happens to be me. But if all our desires were given to us in this detached way, we would never act on them. They would just sit there, a leaden object of our external gaze with no motivating power. It is only when our desires are given to us indirectly, not as the objects of perceptions of ourselves, but indirectly through the perception of values or desirabilities in the world, that the desires have the agentive power that is present in the idiom of intention rather than prediction. The thought X is desired by me, a passive report of my states of mind, removes agentive or motivating power from the desire. Whereas the thought X is desirable about a perceptible property of something, not gazing upon my own mind, precisely indirectly does imply the existence of a desire in my mind with the power to motivate. Thus, desires, if they are to be desires of an agent, must presuppose the desirabilities or values in the world we inhabit and which prompt our desires. To perceive value without is to experience agency within, and vice versa. I repeat, all I've done here is to combine my earlier point about how the writ large point of view of detachment on ourselves abdicates agency, and I've combined it with my extension of Evans's point about beliefs to desires in order to consolidate the romantic understanding of the nature of value. Returning now to intellectual history, this metaphysics of value and meaning as properties present in the world and apprehended by cognition were most polemically formulated in Blake's anti-Newtonianism, an early voice in Abrams' romantic canon, and developed with a subdued confidence in its rightness in the lines in Wordsworth's The Prelude that Abrams extensively explores. This much is obvious to those who are attentive to Abrams's book and readings, but what I'd like to probe is the political significance that this understanding of romantic psychological doctrine acquires when we try to view it as being of a piece with the other main claim in this book, the secularization by the romantic visionaries of an essentially Christian philosophical outlook. How is the lowering of the profile of subjectivity from being the generator of value and meaning to a perceptual sensitivity to a world suffused with value and meaning supposed to be a secularized version of an aspect of Christianity? I don't think that we can come to grips with this question until we notice how Blake's reaction to Newton was really a reaction to something that came to mark a very deep dispute within Christianity in 17th century England. First in England, then via Netherlands in the rest of Europe, though thinkers such as Bruno and Ficino in Italy were antecedent conceptual sources that informed Blake's reactive anxieties, reactive to Newton. What Newton, well, not the Neoplatonist Newton of his private study, nor even the Newton of Newton's laws, but the official Newtonian metaphysics presented by the mandarins of the Royal Society with Newton's acquiescence, what Newton did, according to Blake's utterly prophetic forecast, was to declare and then entrench a superstition of modernity. The idea that nature was to be equated with what the natural sciences study, that it contained no properties that were not countenanced by the natural sciences. By superstition, that's Blake's word, Blake meant that since Newton, we began to take the proposition on trust, that nature is nothing other than what the natural sciences study. Blake said that since Newton, we have begun to take this proposition on trust, even though nobody knows when it was proved, nor certainly has anyone shown how it helped us to live better. What the superstition repudiated was an assumption of popular, if not always high, Christianity, that divinity was everywhere present in nature and matter and was the source of its properties of value and meaning. Pantheism, a term coined by John Toland in the 17th century, was only a philosopher's label for what was taken for granted for centuries before in traditions of popular Christian and non-Christian religious, as well as in indigenous beliefs in sacralized nature. The official Newtonianism exiled God from this immanence to a providential place outside the universe, rendering matter and nature as exhaustively susceptible to the methods of natural science, in Newton's time called natural philosophy. Blake asked, what about Newton's laws demanded the migration of God? And he answered, nothing. Motion, which Newtonianism insisted came from an external push of a brutally material and inert universe by a providential and distant God, could, without violating any of Newton's laws, just as well owe to an inner source of dynamism within matter and nature, which was God's presence in it. But Blake's anger at this banishment of God more than a century before Nietzsche pronounced his death was not prompted by just an arcane metaphysical distaste for having him occupy a merely external station. What he was channeling for his own time, rather, was the democratic radicalism of an earlier revolutionary period in England, dismissed ever since the Restoration by the newly established Royal Society as a dangerous enthusiasm, in which God's immanence had, in Winstanley's phrase, Winstanley was of course much earlier, a great leveling purpose. making him available to the visionary temperaments, which in what I was calling Abrams' sober register is nothing other than the cognition of the world around us, making him available to the visionary temperaments of all who inhabited his world, and not just to the learned scriptural judgment of university-trained divines. Abrams reads Wordsworth and Shelley and Coleridge and the German philosophers that Coleridge famously channeled for English sensibilities as secularized versions of such a sacralized conception of nature in popular Christianity, and he allows this democratization of value and meaning through its everyday cognition to argue for a quite different radicalism than the Jacobin turn that had dogged Romanticism's initial buoyancy for the French Revolution. Abrams' submerged dialectic here is roughly this. An explicit element of the Christian outlook that he's keen to secularize through the naturalization of supernaturalism is the fall, which in Romanticism's secular version is said to be the separation or alienation of human subjects from each other. And so the question arises as to how we must conceive the secularized version of redemption of this fall as emerging from the Romanticists' restoring value and meaning as properties in the world, including nature. In an interesting passage, Abrams discusses the post-revolutionary Jacobin developments and compares the disillusionment of Wordsworth and others with the Auden generation's later disillusionment with developments in Stalin's Russia. Blakean millennial aspirations evaded both revolutions, and so Abrams seeks to find in the ideal of an unalienated life an early Marx, an ideal neglected at the time Abrams was writing due to the dominant Althusserian ethos of Western Marxism. Abrams seeks to find in the ideal of an unalienated life in early Marx a Blakean vision that would radically reconfigure the political ideals of both the French and the Russian revolutions. Abrams does not present the dialectic I'm about to in the explicit philosophical terms that I will. Abrams was not a philosopher, but all his theoretical instincts and literary critical armory implicitly suggest an argument such as this. So here is how I've allowed myself to think of it. The French Revolution declared itself committed to two sloganized ideals, the ideals of liberty and equality. But as soon as the political Enlightenment articulated these two great ideals, it theoretically and methodologically developed them so that they were in a chronic and irresolvable tension with one another. Jacobinism was a lamented symptom of this tension. The post-revolutionary decades in the Soviet Union were a confirmation of the same tension between these two concepts, similarly lamented by poets and philosophers. Abrams, having recorded each of these lamentations, especially in Wordsworth and Auden, turns to a tradition of romantic thought from Blake to early Marx under the label natural supernaturalism, and offers a reconfiguration of the ideals of the liberal Enlightenment. In this reconfiguration, liberty and equality are not on center stage. So you won't find this in exactly these terms in Abrams at all. This is my gloss on what is there in other terms. It exists in other terms. So, as I was saying, in this reconfiguration, liberty and equality are not on center stage in political theory. This should not be surprising, since as we know, Marx, starting with that remarkable essay on the Jewish question, explicitly dismissed liberty and equality as bourgeois ideals. What natural supernaturalism puts on center stage instead is the ideal of an unalienated life. And liberty and equality are then ushered back in, but not any longer as central, rather merely as necessary conditions for this more fundamental ideal. So understood, there might be scope to elaborate liberty and equality in terms that are not at odds with one another. Abrams looks to the entire Romantic corpus to pursue this line of argument, including even the Wordsworth, often described as resigned in his disillusion to conservatism, disillusion with the French Revolution, to conservatism. How is this done? The first thing to notice is that if, as is the insistent point of a natural supernaturalism, alienation is a secular version of the fall, then alienation is of necessity a malaise of modernity. On this, every philosopher Abrams discusses seems to be agreed, not just Marx, but Rousseau and Hegel as well. However defective pre-modernity was, alienation was not one of its defects. Serfs and slaves could claim a sense of belonging, whatever else they couldn't claim. Those defects of pre-modernity were the defects that we sum up with large omnibus terms such as feudal, but part of how we understand feudalism, even in its abominations, allows us the concessive thought that for all the acute suffering of ordinary people under its oppressive framework of social relations, even the oppressed did not lack for that sense of belonging. But what is equally apparent is that liberty and equality were introduced in revolutionary France and the political Enlightenment as precisely countering the defects of pre-modernity. And if they're now to be necessary conditions for the unalienated life, the unalienated life cannot simply be the unalienated life of pre-modernity. So, a hugely ambitious conceptual transformation is being sought by this politics of vision, as Abrams calls it in his Blakean reading of Marx. Not only are the concepts of liberty and equality being transformed by removing them from their centrality and making them merely necessary conditions for an even more fundamental ideal of the unalienated life, but the idea of an unalienated life too is being transformed from its pre-modern understanding by the new necessary conditions for it, liberty and equality, which it must now integrate. It is thus to be a holistically triangulated transformation of all three ideals, liberty, equality, and the unalienated life, all at once in concert. The vital next step is to find first a sort of bootstrapping hook by which the triangulation can take place, and I think Abrams offers us material in a notion of liberty as self-governance that is everywhere present in his protagonists, even in the most conservative phase of both Wordsworth and Coleridge. A great deal of the tension between liberty and equality lay in the fact that individual liberty was conceived too individualistically. By that I don't mean that the contrast is collective liberty. Collective liberty was a symptom of the Jacobinism in the aftermath of the French Revolution. So I'm not contrasting individual liberty with collective liberty in what I just said. What I'm saying instead is that in this Blakean reading of Marx, individual liberty in the liberal tradition, where liberty and equality are on center stage, individual liberty is conceived too individualistically. So that leaves out the possibility that individual liberty, not collective liberty, individual liberty might be reconfigured to be less individualistic than it is. Okay? So it's a subtler thought than just the contrast between individual and collective liberty. Okay. A great deal of the tension between liberty and equality lay, as I said, in the fact that individual liberty was conceived too individualistically. What Abrams taps, especially in Wordsworth, but in a wide variety of other Romantic sources too, is a conception of individual liberty or individual self-governance, because liberty was seen as self-governance, that is not individualistic in orientation. But what is this curiously paradoxical idea that Abrams is unearthing? Individual liberty that is not individualistic. Here I must emphasize with some vehemence that really, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. It is not collective liberty. I'm not trying to reverse individual liberty for some collective liberty. I'm really looking for individual liberty, because after all, alienation is felt by individuals and it's overcome by individuals. So I'm really looking for a non-individualistic conception of individual liberty. It is here once again that the book's own sobering of the notion of subjectivity and moral imagination into cognition impresses with its relevance. The idea present in every phrase of Wordsworth thinking and at the heart of what Marx meant by the overcoming of alienation is this, though in Marx, of course, it was situated very deeply in the conditions of labor in capitalist societies in Europe, I am looking for a greater generality of the insight in Marx than in that particular context that he situated it in. In general, liberty as individual self-governance is the idea that individuals shape their material and spiritual lives by their decisions. But in making these decisions, they are, as I've been laboring to say, responding to the normative demands of the value properties they perceive in the world they inhabit. That means they must see the world's value properties aright. And the idea is that one is not seeing them aright if each individual sees the value properties and the normative demands they make on us, on her, just from her individual orientation on the world. What is that individual orientation on the world? In the liberal political enlightenment, which starts with the idea of the social contract, cooperation by individuals is prima facie commended, because if each individual cooperates, everybody gains. This is just contractualism in the social contract tradition of liberalism. But if each individual cooperates, every individual gains. But each individual is always stopped by the qualm, what if I were to cooperate but others did not? That would be the worst possible outcome for me. If everybody cooperated, everybody gains. But each individual is stopped by the qualm, what if I cooperated and others didn't? That would be the worst possible outcome for me. Locke implicitly assumes such a qualm as motivating his entire argument for the privatization of the commons into personally owned property in the second treatise. An assumption that was made much more explicit in the updating of Locke's contractualist argument over 3 centuries and summed up recently by the celebrated idea of the tragedy of the commons. An idea that gives support to Locke via the sophistication of game theory, basically via a multi-person prisoner's dilemma, the idea being that the only alternative to Locke's scenario of privatization of the commons would be a scenario of a collective cultivation of the commons, but that scenario precisely presupposes a kind of cooperation that game theory shows has no individual rationality standing behind it, thus condemning the commons to tragedy unless it is privatized. And I'm saying that the qualm, what if I cooperated and others didn't, which is driving basically all of contractualist liberal political economy, is precisely the symptom, a pathological symptom, if Abrams is right, of individual liberty or self-governance individualistically conceived. But now let me return to the idea of imagination as cognition. How does it impress here with its relevance for the idea of a non-individualistic conception of liberty or self-governance? The answer perhaps is becoming obvious to you, if I've been clear so far. It does so by requiring that the decisions that govern and shape our lives emerge as responses to seeing the value properties in the world, and it's to seeing the world and its normative demands on us aright. And this is only done if each individual's perceptual orientation on the world's value properties, which make those normative demands, is from a larger point of view than one's own, the point of view of others in the commons as well, from the point of view perhaps even of the natural world itself. There's nothing paradoxical about this idea. A simple analogy can bring out how natural a thought it is. Think of it in terms of a bodily analogy. Think of the contrast between an individual walking on the road and driving on the road. In the former, one orients one's individual body to the normative demands of the perceptible world as one proceeds. When one walks, one navigates the world, sees its normative demands on us from the point of view of one's individual body. But when one drives a car, one is simply not seeing the world right. One is simply not seeing the world's normative demands as one drives right, if one retains the orientation that one does when one walks and navigates the normative demands of the worlds by those lights. Each individual, instead, has to see the world from a larger point of view than her own body's point of view. She has to see the world ahead from the point of view of the car. It is the social version of this bodily analogy that Abrams detects in Wordsworth's idea of liberty, something that persists with Wordsworth unto the last, even during his conservative phase. How are these points about the lowering of the profile of subjectivity to cognition and stressing this larger point of view in one's cognition related to the notion of an unalienated life and its deployment in the resolution of the tension in the ideals of the liberal Enlightenment? The tension between liberty and equality, I had said, arose because in the liberal political Enlightenment, liberty was oriented too individualistically, and I had said individual liberty was oriented too individualistically, and I had said that a typical sign of such an orientation was to be guided in one's self-governance by the qualm, what if I cooperated and others didn't? But if one has removed such a notion of liberty from center stage and replaced it with a more fundamental ideal of the unalienated life, one is struck by the fact that to even have the qualm, this is the punchline, to even have the qualm, what if I were to pay the cost of cooperation and others didn't, is to be thoroughly alienated. If one were living in an unalienated society, that question would not so much as occur to one. And if one's individual liberty or self-governance was exercised in this reconfigured way, in accord with the ideal of an unalienated life, and from an orientation larger than one's own individual orientation on the world, then equality would not be some extra or further notion with which liberty always stood in tense trade-off relations. It would have some serious chance, equality, would have some serious chance of emerging from the deliverances of the exercise of liberty, individual self-governance itself. Let me then return to this insight I'm deriving from the Submerged possibilities I'm reading into Abrams's book, to the framework of understanding. How much time do I have? I feel it's
You said that you want to speak
about another 10 minutes? Another 10?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let me return then to link this insight I'm deriving from the Submerged politics I'm reading into Abrams's book to the framework of understanding of mind and intentionality and action that I was drawing earlier from Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein famously asked a question about the relation between my, say, waving to a friend and my arm going up. He had many subtle philosophical purposes in mind when he did so, and the one I want to exploit is how he used it to propose the notion of a basic action as central to the very idea of individual intentionality. A basic action he defined as an action you do, and there is nothing else you do in virtue of which you do it. In stressing this, Wittgenstein was keen to repudiate a prevalent form of thinking which has it that the individual intentionality present, say, in my waving to a friend, breaks down to various other more basic actions, say, moving one's arm, and for many, at a more basic level, the physical arm going up. There's no breakdown, said Wittgenstein, whatsoever. From the point of view of individual intentionality, there is just the waving to a friend, full stop. That was it. That's what's basic. There's nothing else. So waving to a friend is basic, moving one's arm, etc., are just not in the picture. Now, Wittgenstein was interested in individual intentionality. What I'd like to do is extend the insight of this form or ideal of basicness to what Wordsworth is seeking and what might be called individual sociality. Individual sociality. Let's stare a little harder for a moment at the Lockean liberal legacy of how the multi-person prisoner's dilemma is supposed to render the commons in their collective cultivation doomed to tragedy. A collective cultivation of the commons would flourish if each commoner paid the cost of cooperation. Very often, the cost of cooperation is to show restraint. You don't overgraze, you don't overcultivate, you don't overfish, etc. All the same issues arise today for fresh air, commons, etc. If everybody pays the cost, as I said, everybody gains. But each individual commoner must then think of whether to cooperate or not. And when he does so, he will ponder several things. If I don't cooperate, the gains of non-cooperation will be immediate, whereas the gains of cooperation will only be well into the future. If I don't cooperate, the gains of non-cooperation will be all to myself, whereas the gains of cooperation will be spread over the entire group. But most crucial of all, what I was calling the qualm, the epistemic doubt, how do I know others will cooperate? What if I cooperated and others did not? That would be the worst possible outcome for me. This crucial point, along with the other considerations of immediate and all to myself gains, makes it clear that it is best not to cooperate. But if every commoner thought that way, the commons would be destroyed, thus the tragedy, so privatization is a better bet. That is liberal social contracts argument consolidating Locke over centuries. This is the standard picture of economic thought. Now, it is frequently thought, a thought brilliantly and rigorously presented by Elinor Ostrom in her work Governing the Commons, that all such arguments show is not that the commons are doomed to tragedy, but that we must regulate the commons by policing and punishing non-cooperation. Well, as a philosopher, I'm not satisfied with just the idea of policing and punishing. I want to come up with a different way of thinking. And part of the reason is, as others have said, policing and punishment is itself susceptible to a tragedy of the commons form of argument. I mean, why should I cooperate with policing and punishment if I can bribe and threaten? If I can threaten witnesses who are cooperating with regulation and policing and punishment, if I can bribe a policeman. And for cultures such as this one, who pride themselves that they are not cultures of bribes and threats, as countries of the South are, well, they do it differently. They loophole the law. Who can deny that regulation is a good thing? Of course it's a good thing. But as a philosopher, I am going to try and dig deeper to try and point to a different way of thinking rather than accept the way of thinking of this liberal political outlook and just put constraints of regulation and policing and punishment on it. And one way to present an alternative is to notice that the offending form of thinking, so I'm just going to go back to Wittgenstein for a moment, the offending form of thinking in the tragedy of the commons argument, the multi-person prisoner's dilemma argument, has a marked counterpart to what Wittgenstein was recoiling from in the prevalent ways of thinking that wish to break down individual intentionality, present, say, in waving to a friend, into more basic ingredients, such as moving one's arm and one's arm going up. So what he was rejecting was a way of thinking that looked to something more basic than waving to a friend, looking to things like moving my arm going up, and then adding accretions of intention to these more basic things and reaching up to the idea of waving to a friend. Right? So the basic action for the people he was opposing was moving one's arm, say. You add an intention to it, an accrual of an intention to it, and you get a waving to a friend. Right? And Wittgenstein was saying, no, there's nothing more basic than the waving to a friend. Okay. Now, if we were to, so I'm going to apply this idea of a basic action that he gives to individual intentionality to the notion of something basic to capture individual sociality. If we shift the focus from one on individual intentionality to my interest in individual sociality, we notice that the tragedy of the commons only surfaces if one's individual sociality was built up from something more basic. The kind of thinking that led the commoner to think, what if I cooperated and others did not? You see, there's a way of saying that's most basic. What if I cooperated and others did not? And if we ever come to a social way of thinking, it will be by accretions to that basic way of thinking. That's how game theory thinks of it, that you have to argue for something like altruism. You have to argue for, through accretions to individualistic ways of thinking. So if we work with the Lockean ideals and their game theoretic sophistication, then such individual sociality as is possible would only be by way of accretions to the more basic form of thinking that game theory presents in multi-person prisoner's dilemma that give rise to thoughts like, what if I were to cooperate and others didn't? What Abrams's natural supernaturalism is stressing, however, is a possibility of seeing no build-up to individual sociality from anything more basic. To even give voice to that basic form of thinking is to allow the possibility of that qualm that leads to the tragedy of the commons as something that could possibly arise. That is what and what I want to do by placing the unalienated life on center stage is to say that qualm cannot arise in your mind. Individual sociality on this reconfiguration is not built up out of anything more basic. That would be the point of the analogy with seeing the world ahead from the point of view of the car rather than from the point of view of one's individual body, from the point of view of something larger than yourself. If one didn't do so, if one saw the world ahead, the road ahead, from the point of view of one's own body rather than the car, one would crash the car. And the tragedy of the commons is a kind of car crash. If my own invoking, so in an unalienated society, in an unalienated social world, one simply sees the world from a point of view larger than one's own, and the qualm that leads to the tragedy becomes unintelligible. If my invoking Wittgenstein's idea of a basic action here is apt, to have that qualm and ask, what if I cooperate and others didn't, is literally as absurd as saying that my arm movement is having a qualm about it being a waving to a friend. It's literally as nonsensical as that. I want to stress here how strikingly unusual and original this instinct in Abrams's is, for two reasons. If the idea of natural supernaturalism, that is to say, if the romantic conception of metaphysics, ethics, and psychology, as Abrams presents it, is elaborated along these lines that I've tried to do, one is not merely making a familiar and banal critique of self-interest. One is first of all saying something much more interesting, because one is saying that such critique as one might make of self-interest must be in the service of a construction of the notion of liberty. No one prior to the Romantics had said that. And second, the critique of self-interest is usually made by stressing the virtues of solidarity with or altruism towards others. Now, of course, it's a good thing to have solidarity and it's a good thing to be altruistic, but not all good things are the same good thing. And the ideal of an unalienated life is not to be equated with the moral ideals of solidarity or selflessness. That is why Abrams fastens on the unalienated life rather than fraternity. The point is not that it is wrong to ask, what if I cooperated and others didn't? The point is that if one stresses the unalienated life, that question does not so much as occur to one. It is an incoherence, literally a piece of nonsense. Why? Because to ask it is a consequence of not seeing the world correctly. For Romanticism, as natural supernaturalism, the overcoming of alienation and the correct cognition of the world are not two things, but one. Thanks.